Hello everyone, Leaf Reed here, and today, on guard, for I have the second chapter, or the second part of Don Quixote. So with this second book, technically, it's the same book, but it's in the second half of it, This kind of concludes the entire saga of Don Quixote, and wow. I can see why this is... it's not only interesting because it's one of the first novels ever written, but the way it's written is so simple yet impactful. And honestly, this was an absolute joy to read. And also in terms of the more complicated things I've read from the Divine Comedy, things like that, and epic poetry, it's very difficult to read sometimes. It's very hard to understand exactly what's going on, what's a metaphor, and what's literal. With this one, though, it feels very modern, and it was made in, the early 1600s, roughly, around there, by Cervantes. And it's just shocking how clear, concise, how the chapters flow together. And really, once Cervantes really establishes Don Quixote as a character and with a motivation, it's just a series of short stories that they go on their adventures. And it is very entertaining. In fact, there's one story in this book where I was reading it in a cafe and I burst out laughing because it was so funny. And what it was is there is this busker guy, and he's a pet monkey who tells the future, or he tells the present and the past, not the future, and things like this. And he's kind of like a shyster. And he also does this thing where he puts on a puppet show. And so basically, he puts on a puppet show where he recounts the abduction and the rescue of Princess Isabella, I think. And the knight Gilferes is, riding to save her. And, he comes to this point where he takes her off the balcony and she rips her dress on the grating because she wants to be with him so badly. She's willing to throw all her wealth and stuff behind. And she had been abducted by a Moor. So as they're escaping and running, they're being chased by these little puppets, and apparently the Moors are gaining speed and they're almost on them, and they're almost there, and they're trying to get away, and it's the climax of the story. And Don Quixote, he stands up in the audience, draws his sword, and says, "I will save you, Queen Isabella," and he charges in to the stage and smashes and decapitates the puppets. And the stage boy screams and runs away, and all the people are in an uproar, and the stage is smashed and the puppets are defaced. And then the busker's pet monkey screams and smashes the window and runs outside. And it's this really funny scene. I can't remember the last time I was reading a book that actually made me genuinely laugh out loud, and this is the one that did it. That's definitely the funniest story. And I was racking my brain trying to think that there's a movie or some kind of TV show or something where something very similar happens, where someone's watching a story and they think it's real, and it's real to them. And in a way, it's also sad and tragic, though, because it shows you how Don Quixote, how fragile his mind is, and almost how childlike he is. And it's very strange to the dichotomy. And many characters who come to know Don Quixote, especially the more affluent ones, thinks, "Oh, this is the famous madman of La Mancha." But they meet him, and then he suddenly speaks with such, verbose wisdom, from the knights errantry, which, these are fairy tales, these are fake things, but they also do have real morals in them, and he's ingrained them into his being. And in a way, he exemplifies the ideals of a knight errant, even though he isn't one and is a madman. A really good analogy I thought of for trying to understand what Don Quixote is really like is it'd be the equivalent, because at this point it's kind of like, the mid or kind of ending Renaissance. So the equivalent of this time period of what he's enacting to us is like if we had an early 1900s gentleman who had a curly mustache and went around fighting ruffians and righting the wrongs of the world and stuff like that. And he's some kind of, jungle adventurer. It's like if someone took that persona and fully believed that they were that character. But yeah, the second half of this book is amazingly as good, if not better than the first half. And I didn't really expect that. I don't know. I just didn't expect that would occur. Like usually the first part is whatever. But yeah, what's really interesting about this second part though is that you really feel a change in the style, not in the style of writing, but like when Cervantes opens up this book, at this point, you know, the first volume of Don Quixote has been widely circulated and it's super, super successful. So successful that other writers around Spain start writing their own continuations of the stories. And it's, I believe, a guy called Alavantes or something who writes, you know, the amazing history of the ingenious Don Quixote. No, the ingenious gentleman Don Quixote. And so Cervantes creates Hamete Sidara or something, who is a fake Moorish writer, a fictional Moorish writer that he puts in the story as the true and authentic writer of Don Quixote's history. And so it's funny he doesn't put himself in the story, but he makes up a fictional character to act as himself, who has the authority saying, oh, you know, we need to, in the second volume of this book, we need to right all the wrongs that have been written about Don Quixote and that we have the true original script and know his character. So it also gives you an insight into how popular this book was, how ridiculously, you know, this was like the biggest movie. This was like the Star Wars of its time, I guess. I mean, what I find fascinating is Cervantes lived at the same time as Shakespeare. So you have two literary giants kind of working in different parts of the world. And it'd be interesting to see if they actually knew each other or they definitely knew of each other, I'm sure. But yeah, so yeah, he kind of rights the wrongs. He kind of opens up with all these things, and he even goes as far. It's funny. It's this funny thing where at the end of book one, it's kind of saying that Don Quixote would go on to win this championship and these great battles, or this tournament rather, at Zaragoza, and because apparently Alavantes had already written about this. Just to spite him so badly, he made sure that Don Quixote went out of his way from Zaragoza to Barcelona instead, just to make sure that he had the authentic history, even though in his own past work he's contradicting himself. He does it to show that he is the original text, because Don Quixote was going to Zaragoza and then ended off veering off. But yeah, I love all these short stories. You know, in this section, in the second half of the book, they're still very funny. There's one where they come across, I love how Cervantes writes, where he doesn't care at all. Like he can be developing Sancho Panza and Don Quixote's relationship, and they're talking on their donkey and their horses as they ride along, and then suddenly out of nowhere, and they found themselves caught in a green rope or a green net. It's like, okay, suddenly something's happening. And I just love the pacing of the book. It's just like stuff just happens, and you just have to deal with it, I guess. I love it, and it's inspired me to actually take up a little bit of writing myself, just for fun. I don't think it'll amount to anything, but we'll see. But again, I love the way his plot moves, because you're watching these two characters and you just don't know what can happen at any moment. And so they're caught in this green net, and they get untied by these two very beautiful looking shepherdesses, who are basically herding their sheep and other animals, and the other shepherds appear, and then there's some bull run where they refuse to get out of the way and they get trampled by bulls. Another cool thing that I really, really love is this also is maybe, I don't want to say the first example of story A, story B writing, where at some point, and this is actually the weakest point of the second book, Don Quixote and Sancho come across this Duke and Duchess, and the world has kind of changed in the second book, where, reflecting the real world, where everyone has read or known about the history of Don Quixote in the books now is kind of famous in the world. And so the Duke and Duchess, knowing that they have the majestic madman in their midst, says, oh, you must come and stay with us. And what they do is they pull a series of pranks on Don Quixote to make him believe things that aren't real. And some of them are kind of cruel. Some of them are kind of questionable. For example, the one that is an ongoing kind of joke or issue is, I mean, they put on this whole stage play. They have some guy, they have all their servants, like these are very wealthy people. They have all their servants dress in robes as Cupid and Aphrodite and Death embodied and angels and all these other things, and they come to Don Quixote and Sancho Panza, and one guy's a magician, and he says, what does he say exactly? It's like, because at this point, Don Quixote has seen Lady Dulcinea again of Toboso, but now he's seen her for what she actually looks like, and she's ugly. And so he believes that she has been enchanted by sorcerers who wish to do Don Quixote harm by making her ugly. And so the magician says the only way to remove the enchantment on Dulcinea and return her to her former beauty is for Sancho Panza to receive 3,500 self-inflicted whippings of good force. And I think they kind of did this because Sancho Panza confided in the Duke that he had also fooled Don Quixote on also several occasions, saying that, oh, this is not an inn, this is not a castle, this is an inn, or he gave him things that, the hat, the helmet of Malambrino and things like that. And funnily enough, even though Sancho is the deceiver, the Duke outdeceives Sancho by making Don Quixote believe this affair, and Sancho kind of has to go along with it. And like on the first night he does 5, and it's not until the very end of the novel that he's able to do the rest. And and to that story, I guess, what he does is he's whipping himself, and Don Quixote can't watch because he's whipping his bare bottom, and there's a lot of descriptions about Sancho Panza's bum that are in this second chapter. I wish I was spared, but apparently has a very rotund bottom, very softly flesh, despite him being a peasant, as the book says. And so what Sancho does is he whips himself about 8 times. He realizes, you know what? Oh, because the way Don Quixote gets him to do it, he says, look, for each whipping, I'll pay you like a real or something. And so after 8, he's like, you know what? This actually isn't worth it. And so what he starts doing is he starts whipping the tree. And the sound of the whipping the tree is the same as whipping his bottom. And so Don Quixote is satisfied, essentially after they do almost quite a few days of whipping. But even in the whipping, Don Quixote is like very morose, like, do not try to kill yourself, my friend. I still want you alive. And so you see a lot of different aspects of Sancho and Don Quixote. Like, they have a deeper relationship where they really care about each other. Also, Sancho and his donkey have a certain moments where he like kisses his donkey on the forehead and says, if I was given all the governorships in the world, I would not trade it for my great gray. Just really like subtly charming things like that. I've always started to see Sancho and his donkey almost as like Shrek and Donkey from Shrek. And Shrek definitely has the same energy as Don Quixote, honestly. It's the same kind of misadventures of stupid things that just don't go according to plan, of people believing in the supernatural more than it really exists. Oh, there's another story where they go, so the Barcelona story, they go to the house of Alonso or something, or Afonso, and again, he's another wealthy duke who invites him into his home. And there's this weird aside where he says a magician came to his home and sold him this mystical bust, and it's a bronze bust of a Roman emperor's head, and it says it'll speak, but only on Saturdays, or rather, it won't speak on Fridays. And so they ask it many questions, and it responds, kind of with like a magic 8-ball, like yes or no or maybe, or it is as I have foreseen, or it shall be. And it's just really just this weird aside, and I think Don Quixote asks him about his dream in the cave of Montesino, and Sancho Panza asks about if he should ever receive less lashes for the disenchantment of Dulcinea. And so apparently it's just this weird side story, and apparently there's, of course, a servant who has a tube down, running from the head into the floor below where he's speaking into it. So it's like, okay, well, that's something. But yeah, it's back to the story A, story B thing. So when they come to the Duke, and I love this, what they do, because this entire time Sancho's been following Don Quixote, because in his mind, Don Quixote has promised him an insula and a governorship. And I was also confused about this too, but like an insula is literally like a peninsula, like it is a series of islands or an island. and it's the wrong terminology, and it's Don Quixote's using the wrong terminology, but he means a governorship of some land. So anyway, when there's a duke, and they have great jokes and laughs about how they've deceived these two nut jobs. The duke goes even further, and he says, Sancho, I know you're traveling with Don Quixote for a governorship. I shall grant you one. And it's this very funny series of chapters where Sancho becomes a governor. His dream comes true, and he actually leaves Don Quixote because of this. And Don Quixote goes off on his own, and it's kind of a very sad parting. But Sancho kind of has this whole thing where he writes to his wife and his children, and I love what his daughter's name is. It's Sanchica, and it says Sanchica always has these dirty feet playing, by the river, and she has no shoes, and she would come celebrating to her mother, that her father is a governor with a bunch of eggs in her skirt, and just I don't know. I love that imagery of the Sancho, of the Panza family being kind of disheveled and crazy and energetic. And his wife is like swooning. She's like, oh my God, he actually did it. My useless husband actually became a governor. Like, no way. And so she gets all her stuff ready to go on a carriage and greet him. And so in the course of Sancho's governorship, it plays out almost like a cartoon where, you have the lazy character in the most charge. So he has to deal with people's, problems coming to him with their issues. He has to deal with dispensing, the treasury and the currency. He has to deal with his diet, which is the worst thing, that the doctor says he can only eat a light amount of food and only specific things. He says, but I want my porridge. And he says, porridge, that is for peasant weddings and peasant events. You are not allowed to eat porridge. Never again. And Sancho is like, I am going to die. I'm actually going to die if I cannot eat food. And it reminds me of movies like Small Time Crooks, where you get these very poor people get very rich and they just cannot adapt at all. And it's very funny. And the three stories actually that Sancho gets, it's kind of like a parody almost on King Solomon. Not a parody, but apparently it's from other short stories of the time. So there's one where a man comes into the court with a woman around her leg, and the woman cries, "Oh, this man assaulted me. He took advantage of me. He took my virginity without my consent." And the man says a different story. He says, "This woman I paid consensually to lie with her in the field, and when I had not paid her enough that she liked and asked for even more, I relented and said, I shall hear no more of this." And so Sancho has all these kind of rustic but wise decisions to all these situations. So he says, I'll give the rest of your coin to this woman. And then she walks out of the courtroom. And then he says, go back and take back the money you just gave her. And when he was coming back, she was biting and clawing and hitting him. And he says, if you want the money that badly, you fine, keep it. And so Sancho says, if you had fought half as bravely as you did just now, I believe you would have been you would have kept your virginity essentially, and so therefore you were lying. There's another one that's also based on apparently a famous, in the footnotes, on a famous folk story, and I really like this. It was really stupid but clever, where there's two old men. One man comes in and he says, I have lent this my compatriot 10 gold dulacos, and he has refused to return them to me, and I need my money. The other man says, this old man is a little bit loose in the head and has dementia, and I already gave him his money back, but he has forgotten it. And you kind of say, well, are you lying, sir? It's like, no, I'm not lying. And the old man carries a walking stick, and he says, okay, will you take the oath, and under oath in the eyes of God, will you, say that you did not return it? And so he says, of course, but you must take my walking stick. So he gives the walking stick to his friend, and apparently the pledges, the way they worked, or the oaths that they worked in the court back in those days, is you didn't put your hand in a book, you put your hand on a staff with the cross on it, and you have to put your hand on the cross. It says, do you swear that you have returned the 10, coins to this person? And he says, yes, under God. And so he takes his, hand off, and And he says to the other man to keep the other man's walking stick, for you have been repaid in full. And he says, Senor, how can you say this? Where are my 10 dulacos? And so he orders the guards to break open the walking stick, and indeed the 10 gold dulacos were in there. So the man could lie all he want, but when he went under an oath, under the eyes of God, that's when he had to tell the truth. And technically he did tell the truth, because he did return the 10 gold coins to his friend before he took on, holding on to the stick. It just, I don't know, I found that very funny. Oh, and the last story was kind of a weird one. I'm not sure if I got it correct, but there's a man who says, two men come in, and one says, I am a tailor who has just graduated from the tailoring school or something, and I wanted to test my skills. This man brought me some cloth, and he asked me if I could do anything with it. And so out of the cloth, I made 1 hat, and he demanded 2 hats, 3 hats, and now I've made 5 hats for this man, and he refuses to pay me for my labor, even though I used his materials. And the man says, yes, he's refused to pay me, and he says, I refuse to pay him, because he was experimenting. It was for his own benefit that he made these hats. And Sancho says, may we see the hats? And the man brings out these hats, and apparently they're small enough to fit on each of his 5 fingers. So apparently Sancho says, oh, okay, you will donate the hats to charity or something, as children toys, and no one will be paid for anything. Don't worry about it. And then I think finally it was later in the day after that scene, they have Sancho going on his diet and him hating it. And then they have one other guy come in, this poor farmer. And it's the first example of something very kind of relatable if you know these people, where the poor farmer comes in and he says, oh, my son is getting married to this girl. Sancho says, yes. And, well, she's a lovely girl, but she's a bit pockmarked in the face. And Sancho says, okay. And she has a lovely personality, but she's kind of missing an eye due to leprosy. And, she's a great cook though, but except for her one hand, which is withered. And he just talks about all these, hemming and hawing, all these awful things about this wife that his son is going to marry or something. And at the end of it, Sancho says, good God, man, just come out with, what do you want? He's like, well, I was wondering if I could have 600 gold dulacos, because, she's a lovely girl, but she has her issues, and I was wondering if I could have some money for the dowry. And Sancho says, you madman, how dare you? It's my first day of governor, you asked me for 600 gold dulacos? I haven't seen 600 gold dulacos in my life. Get out of my sight before I use my chair and hit it over your head, you stubborn man. And so it's just the idea of these weak-willed people coming before the king asking for just things for just nothing in return that sends Sancho into a rage. And I don't know, I found that to be very funny. And then there's other stories. These beautiful stories. There was one story, later that night, they're patrolling the town and taking care of people's issues and problems, people claiming that they were drunk and that they had stolen things. But then there was one that was just really interesting, where there's a girl dressed as a man and a man dressed as a girl, and they're a brother and sister who ran away from their uncle's home, who they lived with since their father died, and the uncle, keeping the girl basically under lock and key because she was so beautiful, didn't want her to be harassed by men. And so for her 16th birthday or something, her brother decided to finally bring her out into the world, because she says, I haven't even seen the streets of my own village, let alone the world. I want to go out into the world. And so they disguised themselves as the opposite sexes and went out into the night and kind of got caught because it was very unusual. The constable was like, why are you wearing, clothes of the opposite sex? And it's just this weird little vignette. And Sancho says, I understand your troubles. Go in peace, and nothing on you. That happened, and that's what I love about this book. Things just happen. I think a highlight of this book is the story of the road rogue. Roque. I don't know how to pronounce that, but it's this really small thing where, and again, all of these like stories, some of the big ones are just small chapters where you have this guy who apparently was like of noble blood, but he fell into the life of crime, and so he has his band of like 100 bandits that he leads. And apparently it says in the footnotes that banditry was a huge issue in the time of Cervantes. And so they come upon certain people and steal them and rob them and sometimes kill them. But their leader is still like this noble guy who's fallen to a life of crime. So when they see they have caught the Grand Don Quixote, he says, oh, do not strip them of their valuables. We will take what is in their saddlebags, but we shall keep with their personal items on them. And so he's this guy who, sometimes he'll, for example, there's another scenario where, and so Don Quixote and Sancho ride with them, and they come across this caravan of people, and, some of them are pilgrims, some of them are families, some of them are soldiers who are fighting for the crown, and he says, well, he's not exactly Robin Hood, but he's like, well, I shall take your gold, but... And he says, Signore, please leave us with something. I have my children to feed, and we need just enough money to get to the next town or something. And he says, well, these men work for the crown, which have infinite coin, but you are a family. So for you, I shall leave 80 gold dulacos, so that you may make your way at least to the next town. And he says, thank you for your noble kindness, despite you being a bandit who is robbing us. And so he says it's, he's this very handsome man on the stallion. So it's this kind of romantic rogue kind of element. And then it leads immediately into one of, honestly, my favorite characters. Very short-lived. She is like half a chapter of her, which is Claudia. And Claudia shows up and essentially has said, what is it? She's basically attacked, and I think one of the bandits' men or someone else. And again, she has arrived wearing men's clothing, and so she's in this doublet with these pistols strapped, and these flintlocks or arabesques, as they're called, are strapped along her sides. And she says she has assaulted this man and shot him thrice into as he was riding away, because the story was that he had promised to marry her. And a year ago, and so she had caught wind that he was marrying someone else. And when she came to report, this man that was so bold to betray the promise to marry me, I have shot him dead for my own honor. And so she came to proclaim this, I think, to Roque, because I think he was one of his men. I'm not sure. And so Roque says, where have you heard this, señorita? There is no such news of him marrying another woman. You best rush to him. And so she, in her boldness and her fear, rushes back to the man. He says, I heard that, you were going to marry, so-and-so. And he said, no, señorita, my heart has always belonged to you. It must have been men spinning tales. And basically says, but if you wish, I shall make you become your husband before I die here on this road bleeding out. And so, she says something like, oh, woe is me, my nuptial wedding bed has become a tomb. And she, cries and claws her face and rips her hair out. And even Roque, the dashing rogue, is moved to tears at the sight of this terrible tragedy. And that's the last we see of Claudia. Really just this shocking, powerful tragedy. Really, really intense. And there's a lot of short stories about this. There's always some love triangle where there's a man and a woman, but then there's another man who wants her. Like the most, I think, famous one. There's a ballet that is based on it, and I always thought a ballet based on Don Quixote, but it was actually just on one of these short stories. They didn't incorporate the windmill scene, but they just focused on one chapter about the romance of Basilio and Quitera and Chomancho. Ooh, these names, they get spicy. And so it's a very simple story where Basilio and Quintera, she is the beautiful village girl, and Basilio, he is athletic and dashing and can play the guitar. Something that's a very common recurring theme is that the very attractive characters, all the men, they can play the guitar very well. So very Spanish. And so, he tries to woo down the guitarist saying, oh, I love you so much. And first she's like, oh, yeah, whatever, you're just saying that. But eventually she starts falling for him. And as soon as she starts falling for him, Chuomo, this wealthy man, strides into town and says, oh, I shall have her, and she shall be my wife. And at first she's like, who is this guy? You think you can you think you can buy me? You think you can pay for this? And of course she blows him off. But immediately as she does that, her father, who is the innkeeper, who is very poor, says, Quitera, think of your future. Please go with the Chuomo. Please think of us. Think of yourself. Think of your future. Basilio, he is very dashing, but he is a poor man. And so it looks like she's like, so for her father's happiness, not her own, she decides to marry Chuomo. But what happens then is that the next day, Basilio, and I think like this is all told almost in retrospect, but Basilio is so heartbroken that he says, I can't bear it anymore. If I cannot be with my Quitera, I cannot be with life itself. And so he impales himself on a sword, and everyone is shocked. And of course she comes over to him and she says, oh, if only I could be with you just for this one moment, and I could be your husband. For Chuomo would be happy to receive a bride, or a widow bride. And the priest says, yeah, sure, whatever. And so he marries them, and then Basilio jumps up and reveals that the sword pierced a bottle of red paint instead of blood by his side, and that he is unharmed, and they are married. And Chuomo is furious, and everyone is aghast, but they kind of think, well, he kind of earned it, really. And what happens is Don Quixote, seeing the event, springs into action and defends the newlywed couples and says, this man has acted from his deepest romantic desires. I shall defend them. And he takes his spear, and that deters anyone in Chuomo's men from coming near. And Chuomo essentially decides, well, we've put all this effort into making this entire feast and, this giant wedding, so we're just going to have this ceremony anyway, but I won't actually be married. And so he actually kind of gets over it, because he's like super rich, I guess. So not sure what the moral of the story is there, but again, it's very entertaining, and there's a lot of things like this. Oh, and I forgot the Cave of Monticio. And I'm sorry, I'm kind of moving to the end of these short stories, but yeah, Don Quixote, he's lowered to this cave by this lake called Ruderia or something. And apparently in the cave, he's lowered down by this rope, and apparently it's this magical cave or something. And so he recounts that, well, what happens is that he's been down there for like an hour, and they haven't heard anything. And so they start pulling the rope, and it's very loose, and they think, oh no, did the rope cut? And so they keep pulling and pulling until they felt a weight, and they're like, oh, there he is. And they pull him up, and they pull him up asleep. And Don Quixote says when he was in the cave, he was enchanted with those magical dream that Dulcinea was fully alive, and beautiful to her previous beauty, and in the fields, and there were these other prophecies about his knight errantry and all this other stuff. And so he did this very vivid dream in this cave, and about how they could remove the enchantment. And it's one of these scenes where he keeps harking back to, like, was that real or was that fake? Was it a vision or was it a dream? And what was real in that dream? But anyway, that's kind of the end. I don't want to give away all the short stories, but those were my favorites, the ones that really came to mind. But yeah, I need to actually talk about the ending now. So this is spoilers, but I feel I just need to really talk about it because it's so impactful and interesting, and it really changed my perspective on a lot of things. So at the end of the story, it's funny, Don Quixote is planning to go with this Christian Moor who was a convert during the late 1500s, who basically, in the 1600s, they said there's a lot of Moriscos, who essentially Muslims who had converted to Christianity, but they were still doing their Muslim things. And so the Spanish crown had enough and said, okay, just get out, all of you. Go to North Africa, or we don't care. And so essentially, they have this, again, another romantic story where a father who was left Spain and traveled with pilgrims and became really, truly, he says, I'm a true Catholic Christian. I traveled from France to Germany back to Spain. The Don Quixote and Sancho Panza are on this galley, and they come attacked by these Turks and these slavers, essentially. And they kill 2 of the oarmen, but they're able to take them all captive. And the captain of the ship, who is this very attractive man, who they realize is a woman, and it's actually the daughter of the traveling pilgrim, who says, my daughter, I thought you were lost to me. And so basically they, they hatched this plan to rescue someone who was still stuck in North Africa, or these other Christians, and bring them back to Spain. And so as they're kind of planning this out, Don Quixote is standing on the beach where, for the second time actually, Don Carrasco, who is Don Quixote's neighbor back from La Mancha, confronts him with a visor, and so he doesn't know who it is. And the first time this actually happened, it was at another jousting tournament, and Don Quixote kind of goes ahead of the charge horn and actually takes out Carrasco without him noticing, even though Roxanante is like a very old, aged horse. It could barely trot, and at that one time it actually went faster than trotting, and he was able to take him out. And so the first time he failed, the other joust that he also did was, there was this man who essentially had slept with this woman and promising to marry her, and then slept with her and went back on his promise. And so her and the mother come to Don Quixote pleading with him to right the wrong and force this man to marry her. And so they say they will represent her in a joust. And so if Don Quixote can defeat the young man, the son of the Duke, who took advantage of this young woman, then he will have to marry her. But if he wins, then he'll be let off scot-free and have to be paid something. So, and I'm not sure if I read this wrong or whatever, but in that joust, the young woman, Altisidora, is this very beautiful woman who is the daughter of one of the duennas, which I think is like a widowed, like noblewoman who lives with the Duke's family. And so this is what I read, is that there was another man, a foot soldier and a footman who worked for the Duke, who was madly in love with Altisidora, who then murders the son of the other Duke. It's not obviously that Duke, and then takes his place. And his name was Tasilio, by the way. And so he takes Tasilio's place, and basically he says to Don Quixote, Don Quixote is charging at him. When he sees this, he does nothing. The man says to Don Quixote, I forfeit the match, because that means I can marry Altisidora. And so he does so and removes his face. And again, the man has tricked the crowd, and now he gets to marry this woman. And they're kind of like, oh, well, I mean, it is ending in a wedding, so I guess it's okay. But what happened to Tasilio? Like, did he murder the Duke's son, or did he the other Duke's son, or did he just knock him out? I wasn't clear on that, because that would be like a murder most foul. Anyway, so the third and final joust of the book, Carrasco, after his previous defeat, now comes fully armored, and at that point he was the Knight of the Mirrors, because he had a bunch of mirrors on his armor, and now he became the Knight of the White Moon, because he had a crescent moon on his shield. And so he says, I challenge you, Don Quixote, to this, final joust. And he says, on the condition that I win, you shall retire from your adventures for 1 year. And so Don Quixote agrees, and they charge, and Carrasco is absolutely focused. And of course, he's been petitioned by the priest, the barber, his niece, and Don Quixote's estate back from La Mancha to do this thing. And so he does it and hits Don Quixote square in the chest and knocks him down. And finally, Don Quixote is defeated. And I find this so interesting because many times throughout the book, Don Quixote, he is beaten, he is stoned, he is assaulted, he is kicked, he is, thrown off certain things. But it is only until he's defeated according to his own code of conduct that he actually admits defeat and loses his knight-errantry. And so basically he returns home and as a defeated knight and solemnity. And the Duke of Barcelona, who again was like Alfonso or Alonso or something. Yeah, I'm probably going to find it. But he essentially says to Don Carrasco, "What have you done? You have stolen Spain's greatest genius and its greatest madman from our entertainment. Now life shall become normal and boring and lavacious," or whatever he says. And he's like, "But I did this for the health of this madman." He's like, "But this madman gave us life. He gave us something to dream about, something to live for." And it's finally the dream has been destroyed, and it's the idea, which I find so fascinating. And so Don Quixote and Sancho return home, and so as he's returning to La Mancha, I love this. He sees certain pastoral views and places in Spain where the past adventures. He said, "Oh, remember when we did this and that happened?" And it's all these very charming scenes where all of these memories came back. And I love that when they do it at the end of movies or games, whatever, where you have kind of all kind of like a summary, like all the characters, all the situations kind of come together into this one kind of collage. Sorry, I forgot to mention one other favorite short story where the way that, so eventually the way Sancho Panza gives up his governorship, he said, "I've had enough. I'm not doing this. This is too much." I think what breaks his back, the straw that breaks the camel's back was, they pretend that the kingdom, that the governorship is under attack, and he rules the governorship of Barataria or something, which apparently is a Spanish pun that means cheap or cheap town or something. And so they pretend they're under attack, and they throw Sancho Panza in like the early morning hours into like a suit of armor or between two shields or something, and they throw him out onto the dock. And Sancho says, "I've had enough. I'm giving up." And as soon as they said, "Oh, the enemy has retreated, we are safe," and so Sancho says, I wanted this governorship, but now I would not, trade it for, everything in the world. Like, I want my old life back. I don't care if I starve. I don't care if whatever, because I'd already starve if I was a duke anyway, because I can't eat as I like. So screw it, basically. And so Sancho, it's kind of like mean of the Duke, because essentially at that point, what has occurred is that they've totally pulled the wool over his eyes, promised him riches and a life luxurious, and even to his wife that is expecting all of this, and none of it is real or true. And so, but despite that though, even though it's a prank, the Duke and Duchess do impart with him, all the lovely clothes that he wore, all the provisions that he needed, and a bunch of money for his troubles. And so Sancho essentially, it's kind of sad. So he kind of leaves, and he's kind of in this, he's dispossessed, because he's kind of like, "Oh, this kind of sucks." But he's also riding on his donkey in this very, lavish clothing. And what happens is he falls into a hole, and he lands on his donkey. And his poor donkey, because he's unharmed, but his donkey is moaning in agony. And he's like, "Oh, my poor donkey." And I wish this donkey had a name, but it's just he's Sancho's donkey. And so they're stuck in the hole, and for a while, because Sancho's not a very smart guy. But come daylight, he notices there's a hole in this hole that actually leads to a cave. And so he digs and digs and digs, and he's able to bring his donkey, and he's shouting, in this cave. And it just so happens that Don Quixote is nearby at the other end of the cave, and here's a man shouting in it. And, he ends up sending down a rope to Sancho and getting him out of there and guiding him out in his donkey. And they reunite, and they've been like, it's this really nice moment where the A story and the B story, connect back together, and they become this one flowing story. And meanwhile, while Sancho was doing his governorship, Don Quixote was giving the story about this woman that was promised to Tosilio, and Altisidora was promised to Tosilio, and he refused, and so he was getting all the sort of the story of all that. And all that occurred, and actually, he was training for the tournament that day when he heard Sancho's voice in the cave. And from there, they continue their adventures to the end of the book. But yeah. And they continue all the way to Barcelona and the galley attack, and Don's defeat to the Don Carrasco, And so they're on their way home, and the dream of knight errantry has been defeated. But on his way there, they said, well, Sancho, my dear friend, I've been thinking maybe I should take up a pastoral life, like all those other plays about, for lack of a better word, a slice of life, equivalent of Italian dramas, done about shepherds and these fields and such. And so Don Quixote says, I think I shall become a shepherd. And I guess there's something about shepherd names, because he says his shepherd name is Don Quixotino or something. Maybe it's like Italianized. And so Sancho Panza is Panzanca or something. And so he gives different names, even to Teresa and Sancho's wife and everyone else. And he apparently wants everyone else in the village, or all of his close friends, to join him in his shepherdship, essentially. And so this is his new dream. And he says, I won't return to knight errantry. I shall become one of these shepherds. And so they kind of, come home, and they all greet him, and they're all like, overjoyed, and they, find about his adventures, and they say, we're so glad to have you home. And they said, yes, sure, no, we'll do the shepherd thing no matter what. So we'll keep an eye on the master this way. And it's the next day, or the next few days, and Don Quixote, he wakes up and he says, what madness has overcome me? I only realize now my name is Alonso Quixano, the Good. And so it's kind of after his dream has been destroyed and he can finally rest that he comes to his senses. And what happens then is, as soon as he comes to his senses and he realizes all the madness he has done and all the journeys he's gone on, he falls ill. And so suddenly his body starts failing along with his spirit, and he realizes there's no romance, there's no beauty in the world, there's no room for the age of knights of errantry. And you have this moment, essentially, where Don Quixote calls everyone into his room to give his last will, and he says, for the lion's share of his goods and money earned on his journey as Don Quixote, he bequeaths to Sancho Panza, and the rest of his estate he gives to his niece, who is his last living relative. And it's this very sad, sobering moment where he writes down his will, and the next day he basically just passes away. And it's this very deeply sad ending to a very comical story that I guess, you could argue if it's a tragedy or not, depending on how it ends. But I don't know. I found it so interesting and sad that when Don Quixote, this old man who could have just lived in peace and quiet and solitude in the last of his days, instead chose this insane romantic life spurred on allegedly by these books of knights and chivalry. And it gave him this new life, and he got, beaten and hurt and bashed. But at the same time, he became a man who was famous throughout the country and throughout the world and throughout history. And he became this figure that people could adore and play with, and even have their own ugliness and deceptions reflected in him in a way. And he became this character that was larger than life, despite the fact being at the end of his life, because he believed in this idea. And so once that idea was gone, he said, what have I left? I am just an old man waiting to die, so I should die. And it's this amazing thing that I've seen in some of my favorite pieces of literature, where it's the hope or the idea that sustains and breaks through at the end of the day. And it's this amazing thing where this idea gives him life, and it's like he was fully living by his soul alone. It reminds me of like the Bible passage where men cannot live on bread alone. You don't need just food, but you also need something of the soul or something of the spirit, even if it's total madness, even though it's unconventional and un-Spanish and un-Christian or un-whatever. And Don Quixote did not fit into his contemporary society. He still lived a life that bore meaning in a way, because he believed in this madness and this romance so genuinely that in a way it saved him and made him in a way immortal, at least in our minds. And I don't know, I think that's something that might be very pertinent today, that men need to be able to live by their souls, not just their utility. Like the Great Male Renunciation was a movement in mid-17th century, 1700s France, where men stopped dressing with bright colors of blues and pinks and all those old kind of Renaissance paintings of dukes and kings, where they'd have all these colors and satin clothes and kind of girly looking attire to show off their wealth, that they could afford such things. And men started to dress in black coats and tuxedos, and just said men are only worth what they can produce and for their utility, and that fashion and beauty should not belong to them. And I don't know, I just find that Don Quixote lived this beautiful life that didn't make sense, but he was filled with something, a spirit, that was something in him that was beyond him, that he wasn't just an old man waiting to die, that he was this kind of mad hero. And I just think that's so fascinating, that the ability to be free and full of life and not care what other people think of you and live by the soul is the real thing I take away from this. And I really think that could tie into mental health or however you want to interpret it. But to me, it's such an important, interesting message that has such a huge and powerful impact, at least on me. And so, even though this is a series of comical short stories and misadventures and stupid, silly things, and in its silliness and in its genuine expression, there is also a deep meaning and a deep expression that I think is abstracted at the end. And it kind of ends in a weird tragedy, maybe. I'm not really sure, to be honest. But Don Quixote, he passes away peacefully in his sleep, and he has something inscribed on his gravestone, which I'll just read one of them, because apparently there's multiple ones. By Debelican Academian of La Argamasilla, at the tomb of Don Quixote, epitaph. Here lies the famous knight errant, and badly bruised, and borne by Roxanante down many a primrose path. Sancho Panza the simple lies here too beside him, the squire most loyal and true, who ever plied the trade. You can see there's the intro to the second chapter, or the second book, technically. And I do love how he does say he's the author of the first part, and he really rags on Alavantes, who tried to, I guess, steal his thunder. I'll just read another one, because that one wasn't very, amazing. By Ignoramus, Academian of La Argamilla, at the tomb of Don Quixote. The numbskull who so bravely draped La Mancha with more rich spoils than Jason brought to Crete, the mind that deemed the pointed vein to be needed when something blunter would be met. The arm whose mighty power extends so far that from Cathay to Italian Gaeta's shore came the most awesome muse, the most aware, whoever graced verses on a plaque of bronze. He who left each Amadis behind, who turned his mighty back on Galaor, and vanquished all in valor and in love, causing every Belenianus to fall mute, who mounted Roxanante and went erring, lies here beneath this cold and marble stone. Yeah, I mean, that's basically the story of Don Quixote. This man who no one will ever argue truly lived. This old man and his odd small, fat, round, and stupid companion and went on their misadventures, became legends, I guess. I mean, it almost feels real, I guess. I mean, this is a piece of fiction, keep in mind, but it almost does feel very real. And again, so what can I say about this book? Well, first of all, I love the writing. This is actually a very accessible book. I could give this to maybe middle schoolers and they could comprehend and wrap their head around it. Very easy to read, very addictive to read. There were days where I read 100. This book is large, it's about 900 and something pages, but I would read 100 pages, if not more, in a day, because it hooks you, and it's good, and it feels modern. And also, I'm really so impressed by the way Cervantes writes these short stories, part of a broader scope that I've taken up a little bit of writing myself, just for fun, just to see what it's like. But I just love how the plot, the pacing, it just moves. It's just like, oh, we have to introduce this character and give them their backstory. It's like, nope, a dark knight with a giant axe appears with 2 spikes, and he charges Don Quixote for no reason. Like, that could be like the beginning of a new adventure, and it just swerves. It's just like, okay, this is happening now, and it gives it that sense of life and nowness that I think so many other books try to replicate, but Cervantes just does it. He just doesn't care. The other thing I really love is the way he does the dialogue, because he'll do Sancho said this, and Don Quixote responded, and Sancho responded to Don Quixote, and Don Quixote responded back. He doesn't do that. He kind of does these things where Don Quixote will go on for like they'll have a few exchanges, and then it'll go on for a paragraph once he establishes who's talking. So it'll be like something like Sancho says, "Oh, where are we going, my lord?" And it'll say, "Ah, eastward," replied Don Quixote. And then it'll open up with new dialogue that'll go on for several sentences, implying that it's still Don Quixote talking. It's like, okay, cool. So that style of writing I've really appreciated, and I've tried to like adapt that and take it and put it into other things, because again, this is one of my favorite books to actually read. It's a lot of fun, honestly, which is something I don't usually say a lot of books. Some of these old books are honestly more of a mental exercise or challenge for me, but this was actually like going to the ball pit at McDonald's in terms of mental gymnastics. It was just, just fun, honestly. But yeah, I'm duly impressed. I'm duly inspired, and the message from the story too is to live life romantically, because it will give you a new life that might have you transcend what you could not even think possible. I love this book. I can say this is one of the best pieces of literature ever, and also relevant today, because a lot of great pieces of literature are difficult to read and write. Something else I took away from this book, and there's of course a lot of allusions to the Iliad and the Odyssey and all those, and the Aeneid, actually, more than those two, which I am so thankful I finally read them, because there's so many pieces of classic literature or like post-classic literature that's like, oh, this is just like when Aeneas did that one thing, or just like when Homer said this about Achilles doing this, and it's like, I don't know who and what you're talking about. So I'm so glad. But this also got me very interested in the Song of Roland, which I guess I should read at this point, because it's the kind of like the French version of King Arthur. So there's actually more references to that story and the Knights of Sir Roland, from Charlemagne to Guiaferes, and Durandal and all these other, or Durandante, and all these other characters that kind of, I felt like I got a side education on, classical French, writing. So I think I should read the Song of Roland now a little bit, because it's that kind of inspiration. But yeah, overall, great book, great experience. I highly, highly, highly recommend this to almost anyone. It's just really good. Anyway, guys, I've been talking for quite a while now. I think that's it. That's good. And yeah, as always, keep on reading. See ya.